Hello, everyone. It is actually our great honor to have our next guest, Blaine Curcio, to join us and then to share his insights. Blaine, he's the founder at Orbital Gateway Consulting and also the affiliate senior consultant at Euroconsult. Blaine is one of the world's leading analysts on the Chinese space industry as well as the global satellite communications industry. Based in Hong Kong, Blaine works directly with Chinese and Western commercial space companies to identify opportunities, explore collaborations, and improve understanding of space commercialization across both sides of the US and China. Without further ado, let's welcome Blaine.
Great. All right. I'm going to go ahead and I'll start by just saying thank you, Joseph, for the introduction, because I guess you will introduce me first. So yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chen, for the introduction. I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming today. As Professor Chen noted, I'm Blaine Curcio, senior affiliate consultant at Euroconsult and founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, and I'm here today to talk about China's rising commercial space sector and the opportunities for Hong Kong. I have a short presentation, probably 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will leave some time for some questions and answers at the end. So just a short introduction again, Blaine Curcio, as I mentioned, Euroconsult and Orbital Gateway Consulting. I've been in Hong Kong for quite some time. I did my MBA at HKUST and studied my undergraduate exchange at HKU. I do quite a lot of research on the Chinese commercial space sector and also the global SATCOM sector. If you'd like to connect with me, feel free to find me on LinkedIn. You can search for #ChinaSpaceGuy, or otherwise on WeChat, you can find me at Blaine002. And so today there's going to be primarily two parts to my presentation. So first, an overview of the Chinese space industry and its development over the last 8 or 9 years, and then a short section on opportunities for Hong Kong. And so part one, the industry development of the Chinese commercial space sector. So just a short overview of the broader Chinese commercial space sector. So as many of you probably know, most of the space industry in China today is still primarily the state-owned enterprises. So the biggest one, China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or 𝘃, as you see on the chart here. The other one, 𝘃, so China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. You have a few other large state-owned enterprises that have a significant role. You also have other state players, such as the Chinese Academy of Sciences and other entities like that. But then you also have this blue box, a relatively small but very fast-growing and very dynamic commercial space sector. And what is considered commercial has been expanding considerably over the last couple of years due to a number of government regulations that I'm going to talk about later, some of which are a little bit more well-established and some of which are extremely recent. So again, very dynamic sector, a lot of different things going on. One other point I would mention about the sector at a high level, especially as compared to the US, is the different role of the National Space Administration. So in China, there's the CNSA, the China National Space Administration, and obviously in the US, there's NASA. And the big difference here is that while in the US, NASA is a large entity with many engineers, they build a lot of, they build the rockets, or they used to build rockets, they build the spacecraft, etc. In China, the CNSA is a little bit more of an administrative figurehead organization where most of the industry is indeed 𝘃 and 𝘃 and these other state-owned enterprises. And that does have some ramifications for commercial companies that we may talk about a little bit later on. But just in general, you have the snapshot where, again, most of the industry remains primarily government, but you have this very fast-growing and dynamic commercial space sector. And so looking at how the industry has developed over the last decade or so, I think in a single sentence, it's just been extremely fast growth. So as we see in this chart, as recently as 2014, China had sent around less than 20 rockets up into orbit, and now it's roughly tripled to about 60 rockets per year. And the number of satellites has grown even more rapidly. In 2022, we saw more than 180 satellites. In 2023, we're likely to see more like 300 satellites. We're at a little bit more than 200 now as of October. And, interestingly, historically, most rockets from China have used, it's been one rocket sending maybe one or two satellites into orbit. And now we're seeing more rideshare missions, which provides more opportunities for smaller companies. So rideshare being, a single rocket sending maybe 20 or 30 or more satellites into orbit. So earlier this year, we saw a new launch record from China with 41 satellites sent to orbit on a single rocket. And again, the ramifications for, let's say, smaller startup type companies is if you have a CubeSat, or if you have, a 20-kilogram satellite, whatever, it's becoming a lot easier to find launch space for that satellite. 10 years ago, it was unthinkable that you'd be able to find a dedicated launch spot for a 20-kilogram satellite. And today you have companies like China Great Wall Industry, which is a state-owned company. They are actively trying to find rideshare type demand. They're publishing tables with, we have this launch in Q4 2023 with 200 kilograms of rideshare capacity available if anyone wants to buy it. So again, a lot of changes, but the general trend is more launches, more satellites, and more flexibility for companies that may want to launch their own relatively small satellites. And that's a fairly significant change, even compared to just a few years ago. And if we look at funding for commercial space startups, we've seen a similar really impressive growth trend. So as recently as 2013, let's say, commercial space industry funding in China was zero. In 2014, which is the first year for which we have data, the funding was something like 20 million RMB or something like that. I mean, almost zero. Going up to 2018, we saw this consistent growth, and then the period 2018 to 2022, these were 5 years of just very impressive numbers. So, roughly 10 billion yuan renminbi per year on average for funding being poured into commercial space companies. And a lot of this funding has gone into launch. Probably about 40% roughly of the total has gone into launch. It's the biggest single category. But other categories such as satellite manufacturing, satellite applications, so things like companies developing VSATs, so very small aperture terminals, so that the terminals that you'd use to use communication satellites. Also, companies doing things like remote sensing, satellite data analytics. So companies that take all the data from the remote sensing satellites that are getting photos of different places on Earth, and then they apply things like machine learning algorithms and other stuff like that to those images. They're all starting to raise more funding. Now, 2023 has seen a little bit of a pause in this growth. So as we see in the chart over here, as of October, we're at about a little more than 3 billion renminbi of funding, which again, compared to the last 5 years, is a little bit of a decline. But if we compare that to most countries in the world, it's still a fairly large space sector. And I think when we look at 2023, I mean, there's a few possible reasons for this decline, but one of those reasons, which I think is rather optimistic, is some of these Chinese commercial space companies are getting to a point of maturity where they now have revenues. So for example, you have all these launch companies that were needing to raise funding over the last 8 years, and they weren't really launching because they were doing lots of R&D and their rockets weren't ready for launch. But if we look at one company as an example, Galactic Energy, so 𝗖̀he Dongli, they've now launched 10 rockets, and I think 6 of those rocket launches have been in 2023, and they've launched something like 25 satellites, and those satellites are paying them for launch services. And so that means they have money coming in the door, and that means that all else equal, they may not need as much funding from external sources. But digressing, the main trend over a 10-year time frame, let's say, has been incredible growth from a starting point of 0 to 10 billion yuan per year on average over the last 5 or 6 years. And even though there's been this sort of pause in the growth in 2023, it's not it may not be as bad as this chart looks, let's say, because it does imply a certain level of increasing maturity of the industry, and I think that's a really important point to think about. And so if we think about, if we look at who is investing in these different Chinese commercial space companies, a lot of different entities, and some of them are maybe a bit more famous or noteworthy than others. If we break it up into several large buckets, let's say, we have tech firms and associated venture capital firms. So a couple of the most noteworthy, we have Shunwei Capital, which is the VC of Lei-Jun from Xiaomi. They're a significant investor in several satellite internet companies, also a couple of the launch companies. We also have Legend Holdings, which is affiliated with Lenovo, significant investor. So again, these tech firms and VCs are fairly significant investors within the sector. We've also seen a limited number of large conglomerates investing into Chinese commercial space companies. So Ping An Insurance being one, also Country Garden Real Estate a handful of years ago invested a large amount of money into land space. And these, I think, we've seen a little bit less involvement over the last, say, 1 or 2 years, but nonetheless, it's been an important source of funding. We've also had some general venture capital firms, including some Western firms. So Sequoia Capital China has been investing, also Matrix Partners China, and then also some emerging kind of technology and space-focused VCs. So Essential Capital, so 𝗬𝗏𝗔𝗐, they are not exclusively focused on space, but a lot of their investment is going into space. And outside of these, let's say, mostly private VCs, you also have provincial and city governments that are a significant source of funding. So oftentimes this would be through either a free land, let's say, for a rocket industrial base. That would be the case for companies like Land Space in Huzhou, for example, in Zhejiang province. Also, you've had the Chinese Academy of Sciences and several of their associated VC firms that have been quite active in their investing. And then Chinese universities are actually fairly large investors. So the Harbin Institute of Technology, so Ha-Gong-Da, they've invested in quite a few large firms, as has Beihang University, so Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, I think. But in general, I think the takeaway is you have this large and quite diverse funding ecosystem. And I think if we take a step back and look at which space companies in China have been most successful up until now, it's been companies that have been able to leverage this sort of trifecta of some private capital and then some, let's say, either Chinese Academy of Sciences or some university or other, let's say, large academia type capital. And then also the third pillar, which is the provincial and city governments and this type of capital. And I think for commercial space companies, there's just been a lot of interest from provincial and city governments. I mean, one last example I'll give before moving on to the next slide is the company CGSTL, so Changguangweixing. They're based up in Jilin, in Changchun, I should say, Jilin province, and they've been positioned as sort of a local champion in Jilin province, where the provincial government really wants to develop a satellite industrial base, and Changguang has received a lot of support from them. And they are now, I would argue, the leading remote sensing company in the world in terms of their capabilities. I mean, they have built about 115 remote sensing satellites. Those satellites have all been launched, and then they operate those 115 satellites, and they sell the data from those satellites to a variety of different companies and also governments. I mean, for example, the Jilin Forestry Bureau, for example, is a big buyer of their data. So again, you have this ecosystem where quite a few different sources of funding, and the companies that have been most successful are the ones who are able to leverage all of these different sources of funding in different ways, looking at what unique value add can the different sources of funding bring for these companies. And so now just to go over a couple of quite important policies for Chinese commercial space companies today. And policies, and I suppose also kind of just high level phrases or otherwise thoughts. So the one on the left here, you see the Belt and Road Spatial Information Corridor, not necessarily a policy, but more just a high level, let's say, plan from the Chinese government. And this has been an important way for commercial space companies to do business with countries along the Belt and Road, for things like, China Great Wall Industries selling enhanced navigation chips and other capabilities into places like Cambodia, for example. This has been a big driver in terms of pushing Chinese commercial space activity abroad. We've also seen the new infrastructure, so the 𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫. This is published by the NDRC, the National Development and Reform Commission, back in 2020, I believe. And within this new infrastructures, it's a list of sort of these digital infrastructure that China wants to build out, and they've included satellite internet as part of this new infrastructures plan. And this has been an important enabler in allowing companies to raise funding and to get support for satellite internet, because if the NDRC publishes something as being important or of emphasis, it gives it a lot more legitimacy, let's say. And then there have been somewhat more technical plans. So things like this space-sky integration, or the 𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫 is kind of a nebulous but still fairly specific concept of, linking up the communications network of satellites and potentially things like UAVs, so like drones that could, transmit communication, and then terrestrial infrastructure. So things like 5G networks, or in the future, perhaps 6G networks. And again, when you look at companies that are developing these technologies, let's say I'm a satellite communications company that wants to develop a satellite 6G type of solution, I can point to this initiative and say, well, the government wants to integrate the space and ground communication networks, and so please support my company because I'm developing technology that's going to allow that. And so you have these various different policies. And as I alluded to earlier, this is a fast-changing environment. So just about a week ago now, we saw the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, so the 𝗏滇部, I believe, they published a draft for comments of, wanting to bring more private investment into the telecommunications space, including satellite internet. And so, again, it seems that in general, the government in China is trying to push different policies that will allow for more private involvement and more commercial involvement, let's say, in some of these areas that have historically been quite closed off and quite sensitive. And again, this announcement last week of telecommunications opening up, that's a significant announcement insofar as, telecoms is still quite controlled. So I think overall the regulatory and the policy environment is quite bullish, let's say, creates a significant tailwind for space activity in China more generally. And I believe that brings me up to the end of part one. So now just a couple of general thoughts on opportunities for Hong Kong. And I won't get into too much detail because I want to leave time for Q&A. And I think Hong Kong audience will have some specific questions about this topic, but a couple of ideas. So the first one, we've seen a lot of really impressive industrial bases and clusters spring up around China. So this map we see here, this is a launch cluster in the southeast of Beijing. All of these dots here are, launch companies that are all clustered around the Chinese Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, or CALT. Now, in the context of Hong Kong, of course, there's the Greater Bay Area. There's all of this space industry activity happening in places like Guangzhou and Shenzhen. And eventually this is going to create, or even now it's creating, a real cluster. And there's going to be a need, I think, for Hong Kong to contribute to that cluster. It's going to create opportunities, especially given the general infrastructure being built between these cities. It makes it very, relatively easier to collaborate with others in these places. So I think just this idea of having these large industrial bases, and then considering Hong Kong's location at the strategic area within the GBA, I think that's going to be something that's quite significant. The other element I think that is maybe not so talked about is this movement of people and the role that Hong Kong could play there. So I think that Hong Kong is still very attractive to certain talents within mainland China as just being a different system, a different place, and having different types of opportunities. And over the last few years, it's become simpler for commercial companies in China to hire talent from the state. And this headline we see on the slide here, it's an interesting case of a rocket scientist, a guy, I believe his name was Zhang Xiaoping. He was previously working for 𝗏𝗏, so for a subsidiary of 𝘃𝑎𝑠T in Xi'an. He was the chief engineer in Xi'an. And a company, Land Space, a commercial launch company, they hired him. And his previous employer in Xi'an, they were rather upset by this. They did not want to lose one of their top guys. And so apparently they threatened to sue him. And the rumor in China, and I cannot comment on whether this is true, but the rumor is that this decision went all the way up to Xi Jinping, who was asked, is this guy allowed to go and join a commercial company? And the rumor, again, is that he said, as long as he stays in China, it's okay. And so I think the point here is that there's a lot of talent in the Chinese space sector in China, and it's becoming easier for commercial companies, whether it's in China or Hong Kong, to leverage that talent, to hire them. And I think Hong Kong has a unique value proposition, especially if you are a very talented engineer working for one of these Chinese companies. So a couple of ideas related to, again, industrial bases and talent transfer. And then the other component I think that's worth thinking about is the commercial maturity of Hong Kong as compared to some of these areas in mainland China. One thing I have not really talked about is a lot of these Chinese commercial space companies are still quite academic, let's say, in their focus, and they don't necessarily have a lot of experience doing business abroad. And we've seen this create some challenges for some companies. So as we see in the headline here, earlier this year, 𝗧𝗺𝗍𝗍, 𝗧𝗧𝗍, they were accused of selling imagery to the Wagner Group, Russian military organization, and they were sanctioned. And I think part of the reason that happened is because their commercial maturity is not quite there yet. And Hong Kong, I mean, it's just a vastly more mature place in terms of its familiarity with the rest of the world, in terms of commercial maturity. And so for Chinese commercial space companies, if they want to sell outside of China, if they want to maybe even come up with strategies for how to sell outside of China, I think Hong Kong, as a much more mature international commercial hub, has an important role to play here. And so I think that from that perspective, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Hong Kong to act as this conduit between mainland China and the rest of the world. And I think that's going to be a real opportunity for Hong Kong commercial space as we go forward. I think that's all I have. I guess a short concluding slide. Again, it's a large and fast growing commercial space sector. There's a lot of tailwinds, including government policy and other regulation, industrial bases, etc. A lot of different commercial companies. And indeed, we're at this inflection point where there's a lot of change going on. And so I will stop there. Again, feel free to add me on social media or WeChat if you'd like. And let's open the floor to any questions you may have. So thank you all for your kind attention. And back to you, Professor Chan, to moderate.
Thank you, Blaine. And we have learned a lot from your insight, both talking about the market, the industries, and also the current trend. And indeed, I've received some questions from our audience. And one thing that they really, really want to know is that they're in Hong Kong. They have been actually looking at the different technology development, and some of them that they're even doing the startup. They just wonder that because when we are talking about the space economy market, and as Blaine, you have actually mentioned it in your sharings, and in the past, it is all done by the state enterprise. And even now, when they are sort of open to the market, and they are still quite related to the state policy. So if they want to really to be in this market, what should they do?
So I think one thing that's worth considering is the state and the state-owned enterprises. I mean, they're still definitely doing all of the very big projects. So, the Chinese space station, let's say. I mean, that's still going to be state-owned enterprises until I'm very old, let's say. But there's a lot of smaller pieces of technology that are harder to do, let's say, and that are a lot more open to commercial activity. So a couple of specific examples. Laser inter-satellite links. So Starlink in the US, they've developed this very quickly. There's a few other Western companies. And in China, there's now maybe 3 or 4 or 5 commercial companies that are developing laser inter-satellite link terminals. And it's a small enough, specific enough, specialized enough, and also cutting edge enough technology to where commercial companies are very much able to try to develop this. And so I think that, you know, these smaller, relatively more specific technologies are definitely something to consider. A couple of other examples, things like Hall effect thrusters or other kind of electric thrusters or other next generation propulsion type of technology. Alternatively, outside of the really kind of technological realm, the other thing that in particular for Hong Kong could be of interest is developing what we would call space applications. So China has launched a lot of different space infrastructure, you know, remote sensing satellites, communication satellites, etc. And it's still not always clear what is the best way to use these satellites. And so to have, let's say, you know, really good machine learning or otherwise AI, let's say, engineers that are able to develop better algorithms to more efficiently use satellite imagery, for example. This is something that is a lot more open to the commercial sector. I mean, the state-owned companies still do this, but you know, it's a lot less sensitive. You can imagine, like, a lot of this satellite imagery data is publicly available. Like the Gaofen 7 and I think 13 satellites, all of their data is publicly available for everyone. And so it's just a question of, you know, creating algorithms and creating, well, algorithms, I guess, to more efficiently use and to be more, well, to more efficiently use the data coming from these satellites. So there's definitely, to your point, a lot of areas that are still quite state involved. But I think that the field of play for commercial companies is getting bigger and bigger. And just, I guess, one last example that I would give about this, you know, growing area of play for commercial companies. We saw earlier this year, the China Manned Space Agency, so CMSA, they released a tender for a low-cost commercial cargo spacecraft for the Chinese space station. So this is something that 5 years ago, nobody would have thought commercial companies could have competed for a cargo spacecraft to go to the Chinese space station. But now here we are, and you have an open tender where commercial companies are allowed to bid for that. And so, yeah, I think that the scope for commercial activity is growing for sure.
Okay, thank you, Blaine. And it is really, really a wonderful sessions. And we have actually learned a lot of your very, very valuable insights. So thank you very much, Blaine. And we wish to see you again, and we wish to hear from you again very soon.
Well, thank you as well. I appreciate your inviting me, and yeah, hope to see you again as well. Yeah.
Thank you.